The Zelnari had conquered over 100 worlds. They were the architects of extinction, the rulers of annihilation. Every species they encountered fell. Some begged, some fought, but in the end, all perished. Their empire stretched across the stars, an unchallenged testament to their dominance. Then they found Earth. The High Council of the Zelnari barely acknowledged the discovery. The species classified as human was primitive. A single homeworld, no spacefaring capability beyond their own moon, and technology so outdated it was laughable. The conquest was deemed routine, a mere formality. The first wave arrived in silence, slipping into the planet's atmosphere under the cover of night. Their mission was simple: eliminate resistance, exterminate leadership, and prepare the world for annexation. Standard procedure. It had worked flawlessly for 10,000 years. They touched down in a vast wilderness, deploying scout units to assess population centers. The reports were strange. Human settlements were not centralized fortresses like most species. They were scattered, disconnected. The planet itself was a death trap. Hostile weather, unpredictable terrain, and an ecosystem filled with carnivorous creatures. Still, the Zelnari were undeterred. No environment had ever stopped them before. They initiated their standard protocol, an overwhelming show of force. They marched into a city, weapons primed, expecting immediate surrender. But the humans didn't surrender. The first mistake was assuming humans would behave like other species. The second was underestimating their ability to adapt. The Zelnari's shock troopers advanced, confident in their energy-based shielding. In most conquests, their presence alone was enough to break morale. But here they encountered something unsettling. Humans didn't run. They didn't bow. They fought back. The first casualties were met with disbelief. Zelnari warriors fell to archaic ballistic weapons. The creatures weren't even using energy-based weaponry, just simple projectile firearms. Yet their aim was precise. Their tactics were erratic, unpredictable. For the first time in the Empire's history, a species inflicted real losses on an invasion force. The Zelnari regrouped, recalibrating their approach. They deployed suppression drones, assuming that aerial dominance would crush resistance. They were wrong. Humans adapted too quickly. The moment drones appeared, humans countered with guerrilla warfare. They operated in small, mobile units, striking hard and vanishing before retaliation could land. They fought dirty. They used deception, ambushes, and psychological tactics that baffled even the most seasoned Zelnari commanders. One squad reported capturing a human soldier. They attempted interrogation. The human laughed. When they demanded tactical information, he simply responded, "You'll see." Then he detonated the explosives strapped to his body. The Zelnari had no concept of an enemy willing to sacrifice itself to kill the opposition. This was not war as they understood it. This was something else. A full retreat was ordered. The Zelnari did not retreat, ever. But this was different. They had no counter-strategy for creatures that refused to lose. The last transmission from the ground forces before silence consumed them was chilling. They don't fear death. They are death. The surviving commanders returned to the fleet, their once unshakable confidence fractured. The report to the High Council was met with outrage. Losing to a pre-spaceflight species was beyond disgrace. It was impossible. The ruling elite dismissed the reports as exaggeration, blaming incompetence. But the war machines of Earth had been set in motion. The moment humanity realized they were not alone in the universe, everything changed. Nations united, old grudges buried under the weight of survival. Scientists worked around the clock to study captured Zelnari technology. Engineers reverse-engineered their ships. Soldiers prepared for a war unlike any in human history. The Zelnari did not know fear, but they were about to. The High Council of the Zelnari gathered in silence, a first in their history. The footage from Earth had been reviewed, analyzed, and dissected. The outcome remained unchanged. Their warriors, the finest in the galaxy, had been annihilated by a species that had barely left its own atmosphere. Worse, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was intent. Humanity had studied them, learned from them, and adapted faster than anything recorded in the Empire's archives. The Council refused to accept such an insult. A full-scale invasion was ordered, not a mere planetary strike. An extermination. The largest fleet in Zelnari history was mobilized, a force designed not to conquer, but to erase. Entire armadas, planetary siege carriers, genetic scourge weapons, all prepared to descend upon Earth. The message was clear. This was not a war. This was punishment. The fleet arrived in waves, eclipsing the sky, darkening the heavens. Cities burned in the opening strikes. Their firepower was overwhelming, precision bombardments designed to cripple resistance before it could organize. The Zelnari commanders expected a swift collapse. But humanity had seen this before, not from alien invaders, but from each other. The first counterattack came in silence. Zelnari command ships began losing contact with their ground forces. Not in open battle, there were no distress calls, no reports of conflict. Just silence. Units deployed into urban ruins simply vanished. In desperation, commanders deployed hunter teams to track them. None returned. The Zelnari had never encountered an enemy that could make war without engaging in battle. Human soldiers moved in shadows, using the ruined cities as their hunting grounds. They struck from below, from above, from the darkness. Snipers eliminated officers with mechanical precision. Supply lines were cut, rations poisoned. When Zelnari warriors were captured, they expected interrogation, pain, perhaps imprisonment. They were met with something worse, mockery. Humans would whisper through captured comms, feeding misinformation, toying with their enemy. It was psychological warfare at its purest. And it was working. The Zelnari had seen fear in the eyes of their enemies before, but never their own. Troops began hesitating, reluctant to move into unknown territory. The fear spread like a virus, infecting even the elite warriors. The commanders, bred for war, had no counter-strategy. Their greatest advantage, their overwhelming might, had become useless in a war fought in the shadows. Desperation led to escalation. They deployed bioweapons, seeking to erase humanity with engineered plagues. The response was immediate. Within days, humans had adapted. Not just survived, adapted. Doctors and scientists worked without rest, countering the biological threats with ruthless efficiency. Some strains were even turned back against their creators, wiping out entire battalions of Zelnari troops. When orbital bombardment intensified, humanity simply went underground. Entire cities vanished beneath the surface, continuing the fight from tunnels, bunkers, and hidden bases. The war should have been over in days. It dragged into weeks, then months, then a full year. The Zelnari fleet was vast, but it was not infinite. Their supply chains stretched thin, their resources drained. And humanity thrived in war. They learned faster than any species the Zelnari had encountered. Every battle taught them something new. Every defeat made them stronger. Then the impossible happened. Humanity captured a Zelnari warship. Not just one, multiple. Their technology, once thought too advanced for a primitive species to understand, was being used against them. Human engineers worked at a speed that defied reason, modifying the stolen ships, integrating them with their own brutal efficiency. The first human-led counterassault came in the dead of space. A Zelnari supply convoy was ambushed, not by human fighters, but by Zelnari ships piloted by humans. The entire fleet was obliterated before they could even send a distress call. Panic rippled through the Empire. The High Council refused to acknowledge it. Even as reports flooded in of more Zelnari vessels being hijacked, their leadership denied the possibility. The Empire had never faced an existential threat. Not until now. The war was no longer about the survival of humanity. It was about the survival of the Zelnari. The Empire was crumbling. What was once an unstoppable war machine now moved with hesitation, uncertainty. The Zelnari had never known defeat. They had never prepared for the possibility that a species might fight them to a standstill, let alone turn the tide. Humanity was no longer defending. They were hunting. Zelnari commanders reported entire fleets going dark, vanishing from long-range scanners. Trade routes, once secure, were now graveyards of shattered warships. Supply lines collapsed. Military production slowed. The Empire, stretched across the stars, was beginning to starve. And the humans? They never stopped. What was once an act of desperation had become a calculated campaign of destruction. They didn't just fight Zelnari forces, they studied them. Every weakness, every pattern, every single flaw in their strategies was exploited. The very tactics that had made the Zelnari the greatest conquerors in the galaxy were now being used against them. They attempted countermeasures. They shifted formations, altered supply chains, abandoned compromised outposts. It didn't matter. Humanity was relentless. A once proud warrior race found itself trapped in a nightmare of its own making. Their empire had been built on the assumption that no species could withstand them. No species could match their technology. No species could turn their own weapons against them. The Zelnari were wrong. Their first true defeat came when a human-led assault obliterated the siege carriers orbiting Earth. Those ships had been their greatest show of force, a fleet capable of reducing entire planets to ruin. Now, they were nothing more than wreckage. The psychological impact was immediate. Across the Empire, whispers spread. The humans had taken the war to the stars. The Zelnari homeworld, once thought untouchable, was no longer safe. The High Council, desperate and afraid, made their final, terrible decision. The extermination of humanity had failed. Their only option was surrender. But humans had learned something in this war. Mercy was a luxury they could not afford. The surrender was ignored. Humanity had no interest in peace. Not anymore. This was not a war for survival, it was a reckoning. The Zelnari had shown no mercy when they descended upon Earth. They had not negotiated, not hesitated. They had sought to erase an entire species. Now they would reap what they had sown. Humanity did not send diplomats. They sent fleets. Zelnari colonies, once thriving under imperial rule, became battlegrounds. Their once mighty armies collapsed under the sheer brutality of human warfare. There were no negotiations, no ultimatums. The Zelnari begged, but humanity had no interest in words, only action. The war had changed them. They were no longer the species that looked to the stars with wonder. They were something else now, something the Zelnari had created. The first human warships reached the Zelnari homeworld within months, a feat deemed impossible. The High Council, once untouchable, now cowered in fear. Their planetary defenses, built over millennia, stood no chance. The same weapons they had unleashed upon Earth now rained down upon them. The invasion was swift, merciless. Zelnari civilians, who had once cheered their empire's conquests, now hid in terror as their cities burned. Their rulers, who had declared humanity insignificant, were dragged from their palaces into the streets. They pleaded for their lives. They were met with silence. For every human city that had fallen, a Zelnari world was reduced to ashes. For every innocent life lost on Earth, an entire generation of their kind was wiped away. The galaxy watched in horror. The Zelnari had been monsters, but what humanity had become was something worse. And when the fires finally died, when the last Zelnari stronghold fell, humanity stood alone in the ruins of an empire. Victorious. The deadliest species in the galaxy had met their worst nightmare. The war was over. The Zelnari were no more. Their once great empire, which had ruled the stars for millennia, existed now only in ruins. Their homeworld lay in silence, its towering cities reduced to nothing but charred remains. No surrender had been accepted. No survivors had been spared. Humanity had won. But victory came at a cost. The species that had once dreamed of reaching the stars as explorers had become something else entirely. The war had shaped them, reforged them in fire and blood. They had not just survived, they had conquered. And in doing so, they had become the very thing they once feared. The galaxy watched in silence. Where once the Zelnari had been the ultimate power, now humanity stood in their place. No species dared to challenge them. No empire dared to test their wrath. The message was clear. This is what happens when you threaten Earth. But there was no celebration, no grand declarations of triumph. Only a quiet, unsettling realization. Humanity had always feared the dark, feared what lurked beyond the stars. Now the galaxy feared them, and they had lost. The silence was absolute. The Zelnari were gone, wiped from existence as if they had never been. Their empire, once a force of unstoppable conquest, was nothing more than scattered debris drifting in the void. No records remained, no survivors to rebuild. Humanity had erased them completely, and yet there was no satisfaction, no sense of triumph. They had won the war, but something had been lost along the way. The species that had once looked to the stars with wonder now looked upon them with cold calculation. The dream of peaceful exploration had died with the first Zelnari invasion. What remained was something far more ruthless. The galaxy remained still, watching, waiting. Fear gripped every world that had once stood under the shadow of the Zelnari. Would humanity continue their warpath? Would they see the rest of the galaxy as a threat, just as they had seen their first enemy? No one dared to find out. Humanity had proven their strength, proven that they could not be broken. But in doing so, they had become something else, something even they no longer recognized. The deadliest species in the galaxy had survived, and now the universe belonged to them.